Hello. Welcome to another episode of The Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. In this episode, we're widening the lens to look at the drivers and the constraints of the minerals industry.
Certainly anybody who says, if you just divide the reserves of what we've got by the production to give you years left, then that's a fundamentally incorrect equation because of the way resources and reserves work. They're dynamic, they're not static.
Simon Jowitt is Nevada State Geologist and Director of the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology, and has the kind of deep experience in the minerals sector that is needed to explain things in a clean and straightforward manner. I was very interested to talk to Simon about an article he published with Gavin Mudd and John Thompson back in 2020, where they lay out the counterintuitive trend of why it is that the more minerals we mine, the more minerals we have in reserves. Why the mining sector doesn't appear to be constrained by mineral quantities so much as it is by environmental and social considerations, what Simon refers to in this conversation as permission to operate. We also discuss the meanings of words like resources and reserves and their provenance in historic mining scandals, whether deep sea mining would offset and replace land-based mining or just augment the total amount of mining that happens, how critical minerals are in the eye of the beholder, and several things to be optimistic about. Without further ado, I bring you Simon Jowitt. Okay, I've clicked the recording button.
So I shouldn't say anything too controversial right now.
You should say the most controversial things, because then people will find this podcast very appealing and it will have positive effects for me. I'm not sure how it is at the University of Nevada with controversy these days.
I think we've had our fair share of controversy one way or another, but I don't think I'm going to say anything that isn't backed up by some sort of fact or other. So.
Great. So then thanks. In the episode, I'll give an introduction, but if you can actually just start by introducing yourself a bit, tell the listener, what is economic geology and kind of your personal story of how you came to be a chair of economic geology.
So where to begin? So I'll start off with what economic geology is. And economic geology is essentially the body of research in the geosciences that deals with primarily metal mineral deposits. How they form, how we can identify them, what the geological processes involved in mineral deposit formation, how we can basically use the geology of a mineral deposit to help us if we're mining that mineral deposit, make the most of the material in the ground, how we can understand the potential environmental impacts, kind of everything to do with the geology in the broadest sense of metal mineral deposits, how they form, where they form, how we can find them, what we should do when we're mining them, and there's even things going kind of into the after effects of mining, environmental cleanup, waste, and so on. So it's sorry, go on.
Yeah, so the economic is actually kind of specific too. It's the geology that is useful in the economic system as opposed to other types of geology, which is kind of more broad and abstract.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, we take aspects of most of the rest of the geoscience. So, if you're an economic geologist looking for a mineral deposit or doing research on a mineral deposit, you'll use things like structural geology, geochemistry, you may use geophysics, you may use geomorphology. It all depends on what aspect of a mineral deposit you're looking at, but you invariably use multiple other information from multiple other subdisciplines of geology, and it's kind of attractive in that sense for somebody like me because I find too many things interesting. It's a specialist. It's a specialist who actually is a bit of a generalist, which is kind of unusual. Like if you're a paleontologist, you generally focus on paleontology with a bit of biology. Whereas if you're an economic geologist, you'll need to know about structure, tectonics. You'll need to know about geochemistry. You'll need to know maybe even things like geochronology, geophysics, and so on. So it's kind of a fun part of the geoscience world to be in because there's always new things to learn about different subdisciplines of our science.
Well then, great. That's a good actual segue to your background, how you got from northern UK to Las Vegas.
So I guess at high school, I was interested in science and I was interested in geography, and I was good at geography and I guess sort of good at science. But in geography, there's a kind of natural split between physical geography, like landforms, glaciation, and aspects of geology. And then there's a human geography, which is things like urban development, traffic flows, and things like that. And I wanted a way of doing one without the other. I wanted to do the physical geography side. I didn't want to do the human geography side. And so geology kind of felt like a natural way of doing that. Plus, it seemed like a kind of interesting science. And so I applied to and got into the University of Edinburgh and did a geology degree there. And kind of as I was coming to the end of that degree, then you naturally start to wonder what you're going to do next. And I actually wanted the potential to earn some money and get a job. The geology degree at the time, with the exception of maybe oil and gas, was very pure at Edinburgh. You learned a lot of the fundamentals of geoscience, but not a huge amount about how to apply them. And I saw a guest lecture by a guy from the University of Toronto who randomly wasn't there to give a lecture, but the building the night before had been struck by electricity, so the instrument he was going to be using actually wasn't working. So he ended up just kind of hanging around, twiddling his thumbs or whatever you want to call it. And he gave a lecture on how kimberlite indicator minerals, so things like garnets and ilmenites and kimberlites, these rocks that host diamonds, can actually be used to identify whether those kimberlites are diamondiferous or not. And that was the first time I'd really seen somebody clearly demonstrate the appliance of science, if you like. And that kind of got me thinking about mining and economic geology. And I applied for a master's in mining geology at Campbell School of Mines. I got in there and then I did my master's thesis research on volcanogenic massive sulfide systems on Cyprus, which are these kind of ancient analogs of the modern day black smokers we see on the ocean floor. And that got me interested in research. And then a PhD opportunity came up at Leicester and again, working more on Cyprus on volcanogenic massive sulfide systems. Then I finished my PhD and another opportunity came up to switch mineral systems and look at magmatic sulfide systems. So essentially nickel deposits that are formed from old mafic, ultramafics, a very high temperature mantle-derived magmas. And then when I was there, I started to kind of get dragged off into all sorts of fun things. So a variety of different mineral deposits, looking at mineral economics and supply and demand of metals. And then an opportunity came up at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas to become an assistant professor. So I moved there in 2016, spent 7 years down there as an assistant, then associate professor. And then a year and a half ago, I guess, maybe slightly longer, an opportunity came up to move slightly further north to the University of Nevada, Reno, to become the director of the Ralph J. Roberts Center for Research in Economic Geology. And that's where I am right now, although I've recently moved up in the world. So I'm now the director of the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology at the university, which is the State Geological Survey, and the Nevada State Geologist. So it's been a kind of a roundabout way of doing things. I don't think if you'd have asked me, I don't know, 20 years ago, where would I be right now? I probably wouldn't have said Reno, Nevada, and I may not have even said in academia, but it's all worked out fairly well so far, and it's been a pretty interesting journey.
Yeah, sounds like it. Yeah, so then the idea of this podcast is to give an accessible kind of avenue for people who aren't deep into the minerals and mining space, but obviously it's becoming more and more relevant both in climate change and the energy transition, as well as politics and geopolitics and everything. I'm sure you're well into all of these aspects. And we're starting with deep sea mining as kind of the way in, because that's something that I think has a lot of headlines and not a lot of nuance. And one of the headlines that you kind of hear is that we need to mine the deep sea. Even though there's risks involved, it might not be great, it's still going to be better than land-based mining, which has environmental, social downsides. And so there's a couple of assumptions or explicitly stated trade-offs in this that I would really like to get your take on. So maybe we'll just start with a kind of simple one, is we need to mine the deep sea because we're going to run out of land-based minerals. And we need, obviously, lots of minerals to achieve our energy transition goals. And people put out current resource and reserve numbers and then use that kind of up against demand trends and say, well, look, we only have so much land-based minerals and we're going to run out. And so then we're going to need to go deep sea. So can you, I don't know what the best way into that is, but can we run out of land-based minerals? And then also, can you kind of explain what is a resource and a reserve and how that's calculated, what it means?
I'll start off by kind of just a little bit maybe on why mining is important, because I mean the fact that me and you can talk right now is because of mining in some way, because we're connected by copper and by fiber optics, which use various kind of metals in enabling them to work, and all sorts of different technologies in the screens and so on. And the fact is that the modern standards of living that people globally want are predicated on a significant amount of supply of metals and minerals. Metals and minerals are the basis for modern life, and that's why we use something like 30 times more mined rare earths globally than we did in the 1950s. The same for lithium. Every commodity you can think of, apart from like maybe arsenic and asbestos, we mine more of, and most of them we mine more of on a per capita basis. So every human on this planet uses more metal than we did 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that's just because people want modern technology and so on. And then, as you rightly mentioned, the impact of the energy transition is going to accelerate demand for some of those metals more than we've seen in the past. And so the question is, where are we going to get stuff from? We are pretty good at discovering mineral deposits. We've been doing it pretty consistently for the last, I don't know, well, for millennia probably, certainly for the last few hundred years, if not 1,000 years. And then we've changed the way we mine. We mine on a kind of much larger scale than we did, and we can actually get metals out of far lower grade, lower concentration materials than they could in the 1950s, 40s, or certainly in the 1800s and so on. So I think that's the kind of the basis of modern mining, why we need all these metals and minerals. I don't think we're going to run out of anything, because we haven't come anywhere near discovering everything. As technology advances, as our knowledge of mineralizing processes advance, all of these things enable us to find more mineral deposits and to use the mineral deposits we have in a more sustainable way, or at least make the most of these non-renewable resources. But people do often use the resource reserve figures that are published by companies as part of their kind of, their statutory requirements. As if you're a publicly listed company and you have a mineral deposit, you need to outline what the size of that deposit is, within certain extents, and that's where these reserves and resources come in. And resources are essentially the part of a mineral deposit that has reasonable chance of being economically extracted. So if you have a mineral deposit, say this size, resources are likely to be that size, and your reserves are going to be this size. Reserves are the things that can be mined economically. But to delineate resources and reserves takes a lot of money. You need to do a lot of drilling and sampling and geochemical analysis, and to actually build a model of what this mineral deposit looks like. Nobody goes out there and fully drills out or fully delineates the resources, never mind the reserves, in a given mineral deposit, because there's no point in doing that. What you do is you look at what you're going to mine in the next 10 or 20 years and you focus on that. And then when you've got money coming in from that mining activity, then you expand to the next step and delineate more resources and reserves to actually keep your mine with in the material that it needs to be extracted. And that's why, if you look at some of the mines globally that have been going for a long time now, like Bingham Canyon, which is just outside Salt Lake City in Utah in the US, has been mined for more than 100 years now. And if you look at the original estimates of the size of the deposit, it should have been finished probably 20 or 30 years after it opened. But the fact is that resource reserve delineation is just, or the renewal of that is coincident with production. And in fact, in some cases, the rate of resource and reserve delineation can actually outstrip production. So the amount you have increases actually faster than the metal you're digging out of the ground. So to use this kind of estimate of resource and reserve as all we've got is fundamentally wrong. And if you compare estimates of global resources of a metal to production of a metal, that ratio of production to resource, or how many years we have left, actually has been pretty consistent over the last decade, 2 decades, 3 decades for a variety of different metals. In other words, we're not only producing more metals, but we're doing pretty well at delineating the resources and reserves that will eventually be turned into production. So we're in like a steady state of producing metals and delineating what we're going to be mining. So certainly anybody who says, if you just divide the reserves of what we've got by the production to give you years left, then that's a fundamentally incorrect equation, because of the way resources and reserves work. They're dynamic, they're not static.
Yeah, well, that finding that you mentioned about how, it's reserves divided by production or vice versa, has held steady over the last 30 years. When you published that was actually the thing that caught my eye and brought you specifically into my radar. And I want to talk about that. But if we can just stay on this reserves and resources a moment longer, I think where most people outside of the mining industry, if they hear about this, they hear about the USGS publishes these numbers. And so what you're saying is that those numbers that the USGS publishes, those actually are assembled essentially from all the companies that are required to report them, and that those reports are based on what the company determines is economically feasible given their kind of mining plans. Is that right?
Basically, yes. So that the numbers the USGS puts out in terms of resource or reserve estimates in their case, I believe, is probably what's going to be mined in the next, say, 10 to 30 years. If you're thinking long or what we know is available to be mined, discovery, the addition of extra resources could all increase those numbers faster than we can actually produce the metal. Brings on a new deposit or identifies a new deposit and delineates reserves. That's just going to add more to that without actually kind of taking away from production until that mine comes on stream. Those reserves are pretty, they're based on economics. The one thing to think about is that, if the price of a metal goes up, then the amount of reserves of a metal are likely to go up because more of those resources are going to become economics. At the moment we have record high gold prices, and that means that there's an awful lot of stuff that was too low grade to be mined but has been stockpiled that companies around the world are actually looking at and taking gold from right now because they're taking advantage of the high gold price. So there's always an economic factor in this as well. It's that kind of supply-demand balance. If demand is outstripping supply, then prices go up, which means more material becomes available, so supply would also increase. It's not an exact equation. It doesn't always work, as things aren't often kept in balance, and that's why we do get metal price variations. But underlying all of this is economics, and that's why we call this thing economic geology in a way.
Okay, so the paper is called Future Availability of Non-Renewable Metal Resources and the Influence of Environmental, Social, and Governance Conflicts on Metal Production. And yeah, I think you've basically described the findings there that caught my eye, that reserves tend to grow in step, more or less, with demand or production. I'm not really sure if you separate demand and production. I think of them as essentially interchangeable, that the demand is the production for metals, but I'm not sure if that's simplistic.
There's also the recycling kind of equation in all of this, because the more metals we put in the economy, as long as we're doing our job properly, the more metals can be supplied by recycling. And that's certainly true for metals like aluminum or aluminium, copper, iron, nickel, and so on. All these things are hugely recyclable, and we recycle them at very high rates. The demand that we've seen, or the demand increase that we're seeing, has been over the last few decades, over the last century or so, has been met by mining more, but also by recycling more once that metal is in the economy.
Right.
There's an awful lot of, you see people stealing copper to actually just put it into the recycling chain illegally. But there's a reason for that, and that's the demand for these metals, which is being met by both mining and recycling.
Right. Okay, that's a good distinction. Yeah. So the resources are essentially growing to keep pace with production, so that the production isn't actually kind of eating down the resource numbers in the way that someone outside of the mining industry would imagine. So then my first question is there a reason why it's so steady? Like, I could understand that as we consume more of the resource, we have to find more. And so we go out and find more. But one of the things that was so striking was how constant it is, how it's always a fairly steady ratio. So is there some sort of a reason behind why this is the way it is?
I think we just we've changed the way we mine things. Like I mentioned earlier, we mine lower grades, and that's opened up more resources naturally. And I think just we're pretty decent at finding mineral deposits. So now when we have a mine that say we're good at finding mineral deposits, but we're good at expanding those mineral deposits once we found them. And that if you look at most mines, when they kind of open up, they say they've got a 30-year lifespan. But if it's actually a major mine, then that mine could actually well go beyond that 30-year lifespan. Because the more they mine, the more they know about the system. The more you know about the system, the more you're likely to expand resources and reserves just by exploration, near mine exploration, or what we call brownfield exploration. It's exploration close to the mine in an environment that you know a lot about, and that makes the delineation and identification of new areas of mineralization a lot easier than just going out in the middle of nowhere and starting from scratch. We're pretty good at finding things, and we're really good at expanding those things once we find them, often faster than production.
Okay, so then, so this was published in 2020, and I was kind of like, shouldn't this just be in kind of chapter 1 of the economic geology textbook? Can you maybe just talk about what made you publish this, and was it sort of always known and you just realized that nobody had actually written it up, or was like how scientifically novel was this?
I guess me and my co-authors, I don't think it's one of these things that I think is fairly well known, but it's also a case where people, it's lies of statistics. If you have numbers, you can manipulate those numbers in whatever way you want. And I think me and my co-authors got a little bit fed up of seeing the same papers talk about, or not the same papers, but the papers talk about how we're going to run out of mineral X by year Y. And if you actually do some number crunching like we did, then the numbers don't follow that course. There were papers in the 2000s which said we should have run out of certain metals already. And the fact is we certainly haven't run out of anything. And that's because of the way resources and reserves are calculated, and the fact that these things are dynamic rather than static. And I think we got a little bit fed up with seeing the same arguments and decided to try and write something that wouldn't refute the arguments, but would look at the data and see what came out. I mean, one of the findings was this kind of steady state system for most of the major metals, where the reserve depletion, the mining of these reserves, is replaced by the addition of reserves as a result of exploration and expansion and so on. I think the other part of the piece of the paper is the fact that it's the environmental social challenges side of things. And that's, if you find something, you've got to have the ability or the permission to mine it. I think that's going to be what we're pretty good at finding things, but we need to probably still improve in getting that permission, that environmental and social permission to actually mine the deposits that we know about. So there's no point in finding something if you can't actually extract the metal from it. It's just it's an interesting geological study, perhaps, for sure, but it won't actually do anything in terms of meeting the metal demand that we're seeing now and is likely to accelerate.
Yeah, and so that is essentially becoming the major constraint that you see on metal production. So when we think about meeting the targets of whichever forecast it is that says how many times we have to X our copper or nickel production, it's not the USGS reserve numbers that we need to be thinking about. It's essentially the ESG constraints that are going to be imposed on expanding the mining system to meet this.
Yeah, I think then we are seeing changes in that already. We're seeing, the mining companies realize that if they're going to be successful, they need to have this permission to operate. I mean, people talk about license to operate. A license is a legal thing, whereas a permission is something that can be removed at any time. And that's the kind of reality of the situation. And I think that it's beholden on mining companies to actually think about not just, people talk about this kind of triple bottom line, where instead of just thinking about economic value, we need to think about what environmental and social value mining companies and mining operations can bring to local communities and local environments. And I think that the days where, an open pit mine is just a hole in the ground full of problems, it need to be kind of put in the past, because this is the big challenge we have, is this actually, not just finding the things, but making sure we can extract the things in an environmentally and socially acceptable way. And that, that we need to think about resource benefits rather than resource curses has been the case in the past. And that means giving people, assurances about the environmental impacts or lessening of environmental impacts, or even improving an environment if there's, for example, legacy mine waste that could be cleared up from previous mining operations and things like this. And certainly social benefits should last longer than the lifespan of a mine, because once that mine is gone and the natural resource is gone, it's not coming back. So there's a lot of thinking in these areas going on, and certainly this is one way of approaching those environmental social challenges, is making them environmental and social opportunities, and flipping things around and thinking about how we can create multiple types of value, not just economic value from a mining operation.
If we think about ESG constraints, obviously they're very locally varied. In some parts of the world, they're strict, arguably to the point of just, shutting down mining in much of the developed world. And then in other parts of the world, they're, I guess, missing. Well, I shouldn't say missing, but they're different, right? So when you're talking to kind of the average consumer, educating them about, mining is not only sticking around, it's growing, and the ESG constraints are going to be the major factor going forward. Is the current kind of mining world able to respond to ESG constraints?
They're having to. So we're already seeing the cost of not actually kind of paying attention or doing things in the kind of proper way, if you like, or the ethical way, you might call it. There's been a number of incidences where companies have been fined significant amounts of money, but also there was so one example would be an iron ore mine in Western Australia. I think it was operated by Rio Tinto, where there's this area with indigenous Aboriginal significance called Yukon Gorge, and the company had the legal permission to go in and actually kind of destroy that gorge area as a result of mining. And they went in and did so, and that caused an outcry because there was a lot of cultural heritage kind of value to that area. And it meant that, the company had to give a whole lot of apologies. And a few people in the company, I think potentially including even the CEO, lost their jobs as a result of that.
So.
And there's changes in the law in Australia as well. So that's the kind of the penalty people will pay for not doing things the right way. It's okay having the legal right to do it, but I think we need to think about what's the ethical thing to do, or how do we maintain these permissions to operate? Because, they had the license to operate, but they didn't have the permission. If the CEO of a company loses their job as a result, then other CEOs of other companies are probably going to go, well, maybe we need to do things a little differently, or think about this a little more, because a company being fined is going to probably affect the shareholders rather than the CEO. But if the CEO loses their job as a result because of shareholder anger over it, or because of just general public anger over something that a company does, then that's a fairly significant step towards these companies realizing the real value of environmental and social acceptance and so on.
Yeah, when I heard that story about that Rio Tinto situation where they destroyed, I guess, some caves that had real ancient Aborigine artifacts and significance, and the way that it was told to me really made me kind of wonder, okay, well, how many more of those caves got dynamited in the past before we've now gone to the threshold where society says, okay, that's no longer something that we can turn away from.
Just I think this is one thing that we kind of need to remember, is the fact that the Environmental Protection Agency in the US was only set up in the 70s, I believe. So, on the environmental side, we only really started thinking about the negative impact of any sort of industry, but certainly the mining industry in the 1970s. And the social side of things, in many cases, came along after that. So we haven't actually been thinking about the negative impacts of these industries all that long. And I think we're still not perfect. The minerals industry is still not perfect by any means, but they've they're moving in the right direction, and sometimes moving an entire industry in the right direction takes quite a long time.
Yeah, it's actually that's quite an optimistic message. You hear about how it's very difficult to trace the ESG considerations of the minerals in whatever in your electric car. You don't know whether it's coming from the Congo or Indonesia or northern Canada. But I guess those challenges we haven't put the resources into solving those for very long. So we're maybe on our way to solving them.
If not solving them, getting better at them. I don't think there's any kind of perfect solution to anything, but I think the fact that consumers are becoming more and more aware of where things come from mining, which is a good thing, but also where, that where they come from in terms of geographical location and mining operation also is important. And I think we dealt with like blood diamonds reasonably effectively, but we still need to deal with other conflict minerals better, and we still need to think about, like you say, if you're using nickel in your electric vehicle battery, is that nickel from Indonesia where there's significant biodiversity loss as a result of some of the nickel laterite operations over there? As I think a paper last year kind of outlined some of those challenges or some of those negative impacts, or are they coming from a more environmentally friendly mine? It's somewhere in Canada or in the US or wherever. I think that tracking of metals is difficult because it goes from a mine to a smelter, then a smelter to a manufacturing facility, then a manufacturing facility to in the case of electric vehicles, an assembly facility, and then that facility to a consumer. But tracing all of those steps of various metals is pretty challenging. And I think that's where people are talking about using blockchain type approaches to identify these things, and discussing whether if consumers pay a premium for ethically sourced diamonds or gold, would they pay a premium for ethically sourced copper in their electric vehicle and things like this. So I think there's a lot of those conversations to have, and I think all of those conversations move us towards consumers being more informed, not just about the importance of mining, but also where the stuff they're actually using comes from. And I think that we're seeing that in farming. People like to know where their stuff's coming from and like to know what sort of farm environments the animals or the producers come from, whether it's organic or whatever, Rainforest Alliance or whatever these things are. But we haven't seen that in the metal sphere as yet, probably because consumers up until recently haven't been thinking about where stuff comes from.
I imagine that there's a bigger substitutability challenge in the metals industry where you can, in the case of nickel, you can sort of move around even if you kind of classify some amount of nickel as good and Indonesia as less good, and Indonesia is whatever it is, 60% of the nickel production right now, you can still take enough of the good nickel and put it into the electric car stream, and all the electric cars could feel good about buying good nickel. But you wouldn't actually affect the rest of the system because there's so much more nickel going into stainless steel.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't exactly thought through how that's different than bananas. When you're buying bananas from somewhere, those bananas are coming straight to you and they're not getting mixed into a big kind of banana pool somewhere and things. It's not totally fungible. But it's nice to hear your kind of optimism that this is a challenge that's relatively new, that we are developing approaches and methodologies, and so we'll get somewhere. That's more optimistic than I've kind of felt about it lately.
I think I'm optimistic, or I'm positive, but also I realize that we need to do better than we are doing already. So every challenge is an opportunity, and this is there's a whole load of challenges associated with metal supply, but all of those challenges are opportunities to do things better or improve things than they are now. So I think if you're not optimistic, then you become pessimistic and depressed, and I try to avoid that way of thinking if possible.
Let me take you back to this paper we've been talking about how resources ratio to production has held fairly steady. So you had data going back to, 1950 or so? And is that because that's as far back as resources and reserves have been quantified and recorded?
We could probably have gone back further, but then the uncertainties sort of increase, and real kind of resources and reserves have been around for a little while now, but they were basically brought in as a result of mining scandals. So people kind of the way we report resources and reserves was formalized as a result of people essentially overstating resources and reserves where there actually wasn't the amount of mineralization they said, or in some cases, there wasn't any real mineralization at all. And the classic example of that was the 1990 scandal of Bre-X, where a small Canadian exploration company went into Indonesia and started to explore for gold. They started to find gold. Apparently, they did more and more exploration. They delineated this thing that they called a huge resource or reserve, and basically there wasn't the formalized reporting that we have now. And the other thing was that all of the gold they had was being actually analyzed as a result of, they were doing what's called salting the sample. So basically, somebody was taking like little cuttings of jewelry and actually putting it in the samples that were to be analyzed in the lab to tell you how much gold you have. So this kind of systematic salting basically meant that this tiny Canadian company ended up with a $6 billion value on the stock exchange, which disappeared overnight, and a lot of people lost money. It's a really interesting story. It involves a geologist called Michael de Guzman. He was one of the major exploration geologists on site, either falling from or being pushed from a helicopter. There's rumors that he's still alive somewhere. There's all sorts of interesting things that came out of that, and that had real ramifications for the way we formally delineate and determine what a resource is and a reserve is, and to make sure that people didn't lose money in those kind of scams in the future. And I think we've gone a long way from. I'm pretty sure it was Mark Twain who said a gold mine is a hole in the ground with a liar at the top, and I think we've moved on a significant way from there, thankfully.
Really makes me, this is another case where you realize how at the beginning of any data stream is somebody who puts the data into whatever the paper, which then gets taken and tabulated into a computer and then gets put into a database. And it wasn't until I started working in research that I've really had to start questioning, where did all these numbers actually come from? I mean, blockchain is all well and good. Blockchain is a very rigorous, safe way of keeping people from changing numbers once they're in a computer. But yeah, there's still somebody who's got to put the very first number somewhere, and blockchain can't get past that, I guess.
And certainly, I mean, the people have been compiling like the production statistics for a while. So there's some production statistics going back, decades. Others going back maybe 1.5 centuries or things like this. And various groups have published them for various reasons, so that the US and British geological surveys are the main kind of repositories for global data. But if you go back to like gold rush times in Western Australia, you can look up in historical documents how much of the what we call gold batteries, basically the quartz that people were digging up were taken to these batteries where it was crushed and gold could be extracted. And a lot of them were run by the government. So the government wanted to know exactly how much gold was coming out of the ground for things like tax purposes, and revenue purposes. So I think there's always some sort of ulterior motive to collate these statistics, and it's usually around money. If you don't know how much gold is being extracted, you don't know how much tax to actually charge people on that gold, or royalties or whatever.
Right, so thank goodness for the tax man.
I'm not going to go that far, but taxes are a necessary evil, but that's all I'm going to say on that matter.
Okay, so then you've got this data going back from 1950 to I don't know if you did it all the way up to 2020, but the question is, should we expect this trend to continue, or is there some reason why we're starting to kind of bump up against kind of what the technology development or the economics is going to allow for these resources to expand?
I think I'm going to give the scientific answer. It depends. So if we look at there's going to be some sectors where it might be more challenging. Like if you look at copper, for example, because copper has been a well-established metal that we've mined for hundreds or thousands of years in some cases, then significant expansion of that sector, if needed, could be a bit more of a challenge than kind of other metals like lithium, where if you look around at lithium right now, the lithium production is significantly increased, but there's an awful lot of lithium that we now know about in the ground which could come on stream and actually and actually kind of enable lithium to come to market. And lithium is kind of an interesting example because it's still a small sector and it's likely to remain small for a while. And that means that one or two big mines coming on stream can actually have a significant influence in terms of that supply-demand balance, and as well as policy and things like other kind of things that can change demand. And so that's what we saw in 2022, a peak in lithium price. Then the lithium price slumped again, and that slump is because we've gone into a period of oversupply of lithium. And that also happened with nickel as well, interestingly, where all these Indonesian nickel suppliers decided to put more nickel onto the market. And the estimates that we might be running short of nickel ores all of a sudden didn't come true, at least on the short term. And we're actually having mines being shut down because the nickel price is low because we've got too much nickel on the market. So we will see in the long term increased demand for a range of metals. We don't exactly know what those metals are. We don't exactly know how much that demand increase is going to be, and we don't know what rate it's going to happen at, whether we're going to see a constant increase or whether it's going to be this stop-start kind of change, and the influence of things like new mines coming on stream, policy changes over electric vehicles and so on, and all of these things are going to affect this supply-demand balance globally. And it's this question of timescales and the way things operate on different timescales is kind of an interesting one.
Yeah, so that actually leads me into my next question, which, to kind of put it simply, will deep sea mining offset terrestrial mining, or will it add on top? So people often put it, deep sea mining is the lesser of two evils, putting aside whether or not that's true with the uncertainties. But in that assumption is kind of like, if we mine the deep sea, we will stop mining somewhere else on land. And then I'm of two minds of how to think about this. On the one hand, I look at the history of fossil fuels and see that, when oil became a kind of a superior fuel to coal, we didn't use less coal. I heard we have used more coal last year than we've ever used in history. When natural gas came on the market, it didn't take a bite out of the amount of oil that was being used. But then you also just gave this example of how Indonesia has ramped up nickel production, and so they're shutting down nickel producers elsewhere, which I had been told was unlikely to happen, and then here it's happening. So the short question, will deep sea mining offset terrestrial mining? And if you give the scientific answer, then what are the factors that kind of make this more or less likely to happen?
I don't think it will, is going to be my answer, because, I mean, the boils down to economics. If you can produce metals more cheaply from the deep sea than you can from on land, then question number one is, why haven't we been why haven't we done that already? And question number two is, then if you want deep sea mining to offset terrestrial mining, you have to have some sort of way that deep sea mining is better, at least nominally economically, than on land mining. And the fact that we haven't had a successful deep sea mining operation, the only sea mining operation I can really think of that's been a success is like De Beers hoovering up diamonds offshore of Namibia, and that's not the deep sea. That's fairly shallow waters. There's a lot of potential in the deep sea. There's a lot of resources out there, but the fact is that the economics of those resources are likely to be just as challenging as economics of mining on land. At the end of the day, if you want to do that mining operation, the term ore is an economic term. It means something that's economic, something that you can dig up to make a profit. I am yet to see anybody operating in the deep sea environment that's turning a significant profit and challenging some of the producing significant profit and producing metals of such a volume that it's challenging the on-land producers. I think it's if we do deep sea mining, it's more likely that that'll just contribute to meeting the demand that we'll see as a result of the energy transition, although that stop-start demand that we're seeing means that economics of any mining operation anywhere, it can be challenging at times.
And when you drive down the cost of a mineral, of a metal, obviously you drive up the consumption of that metal. I mean, everybody was trying to move away from nickel-heavy cathodes in electric vehicles, and then the price of nickel got pushed down by Indonesia to the point that mines closed. Why didn't the automakers just buy up all of that nickel?
Probably because there isn't the demand for it right now. in and around when we saw like the peak in nickel price and peak in nickel demand and lithium price and lithium demand in 2022, there was a whole lot of tax breaks for people to buy electric vehicles, and that meant there was a significant amount of electric vehicle demand leading up to the end of 2022, for example, in the US. Those tax breaks changed at the end of 2022, which meant that demand went down because everybody had already bought their electric vehicles. And so we ended up in a bit of a slump where, the nickel and lithium sectors suffered as a result of that accelerating rate of EV uptake slowed down. So I think at a time when Indonesia brought more nickel onto the market, so I think it's that kind of an increase in supply from one area of the world combined with a decrease in demand as a result of seemingly policy changes and the slowing down of uptake of electric vehicle use. It was a kind of double whammy that meant that certain parts of the nickel sector became challenging. And, those mines may well open up, almost certainly will open up in the near future again, because we'll have a rebalancing of that nickel supply and demand balances. And people want electric vehicles again because that electric vehicle demand is going to keep on increasing. It's not a smooth curve; it's steps. Those steps are difficult to kind of reconcile with the lifespan or operation times of mining operations. That if you find something tomorrow that's a mineral deposit tomorrow, it'll probably be 10 years before you mine it. So predicting the economics of something in 10 years' time is kind of challenging.
Okay, so then let me ask you more directly. I understand you haven't put a lot of effort and thought into deep sea mining. I mean, I've heard you say that you're skeptical of the economics of it. What other thoughts do you have on deep sea mining in general? One thing that crosses my mind is that it so far seems to have kind of demonstrated your second conclusion of your paper. Your second conclusion being ESG concerns are going to be the main constraint on a lot of mining in the future. And we've seen the pushback of social permission to deep sea mine being sort of extreme to the point that, at least in Norway, it's really slowed down the regulatory scheme. Do you have any general thoughts on deep sea mining? Do you see it as a realistic place that the mining industry is going to go?
The adage that we know more about the surface of the moon than certain parts of the deep parts of the ocean probably holds true. And I think that we already know that human activities in any part of the ocean could be negative. If you look at kind of the impacts of trawler-style fishing, or if you're thinking about like other extraction from the deep sea environment, things like Deepwater Horizon and so on, these are things that, these are areas where it's logistically difficult to operate in. With a mine, a surface mine or even an underground mine, we've been doing this for decades, hundreds of years. We know what the challenges are. We know what the impacts are likely to be. We can monitor those impacts and see those impacts. It's very difficult, I would imagine, to actually monitor the impact of something that's going on in a deep sea environment, especially once you start, say, essentially vacuuming up nodules from large areas of the seafloor. I mean, if you can tell me somebody who exactly knows what the impact of that is going to be and what the flora and fauna is down there, we can't just think of these areas as deserts, and we can't just think of these areas as being in isolation of the rest of the ocean. We live in an environment where there's feedbacks of all different types. I just simply don't think we know what those feedbacks are going to be. You could say that the best way of doing it is by actually trial mining, but the fact is that once you started that, then you're already making impacts, and we don't know what those impacts are going to be. So I think we need to know more about the environments that we're thinking about operating in before we take the plunge, quite literally, and go into deep sea mining. There's just too many. I would say there's too many uncertainties, and people that say, well, there's less environmental and social impacts than on land mining, perhaps haven't thought through what the environmental and social impacts could be, especially as a lot of humanity is somewhat reliant on things we get from the sea to begin with. I'm not saying that, fishing in Norway could be affected by extraction of nodules in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, thousands of miles away. But the fact is, we don't know what those feedbacks are, and we don't know what would happen on, if we do start mining on a large scale in these areas. So it's a challenge, and uncertainty is always the kind of, is something you ignore at your peril. And I think that that's the real issue here, is that we don't know we don't know with certainty what the impacts are going to be, how you can mitigate against those impacts, and what will happen in the short, medium, and long term once we do start these activities, or if we do start these activities in a big way.
So you feel like that's significantly different than mining, where the downsides are sort of known. We've been doing this sort of thing for long enough that it's possible to do relatively responsible, environmental and social approval processes on land, whereas you feel the uncertainties in the deep sea are maybe just too big for us even to make that comparison responsibly.
I think so. I think we can characterize the environment in around a terrestrial mine much better than we can in the deep sea. I mean, if you look at some of the there's a mine here in Nevada called or a potential mine called Rhyolite Ridge. There's an indigenous plant called Team's buckwheat, which only seems to live in that kind of area. And, there's been a lot of controversy over whether that lithium mine should go ahead as a result of the presence of that plant that isn't really found anywhere else. And the company who's operating the mine has developed ways of actually kind of growing this Team's buckwheat in a kind of growing it and replacing it and making sure that the impacts are lessened, and they have got permission to operate. But if you're talking about deep sea mining, how do you know what's down there? I mean, you can't go down there and do a walkover survey of any sort of the flora and fauna down there. And if you assume that there's nothing down there, then that's just kind of being almost, I don't want to say willfully ignorant, but it's certainly ignoring what could potentially be down there, because we don't, I have no idea what's in the deep sea environment. And every time you see somebody go down in one of these submersibles, there's always something a little surprising that turns up. So I think until we have a better idea of what's going on in specific areas that people want to mine in, then I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge. And the fact is that if we're talking about fauna, then creatures move around. I don't know what we know about kind of migration patterns on land, both in the air and you can mitigate against like caribou migration patterns in the Arctic and so on. But I don't know what migration patterns are like in the ocean, and I don't know what the impact of mining could be. So until we start to resolve some of these or build up more knowledge specific to the areas that people are going to mine, and also think about the distal challenges or distal impacts that this mining could have, then I'm skeptical, because I don't know. I'm not an expert in this, but I don't think I don't know if anybody knows. And that's the concerning thing for me, is that we don't know enough about operating in these environments.
Yeah, well, that example of the buckwheat and the mitigation measure, that's actually really helpful, because it puts a little bit of specifics on something which is often just kind of considered, I think, in the abstract. And when you realize that, okay, not only do you have to do an environmental background ground study on mining, but then if you find something, you have options and you have to take measures. And then, like you say, all of this background knowledge about migration, it really fills in the picture, at least for me, on what it means to be uncertain about a future mining situation and how much knowledge we really do have. I guess that was the questions I had for you, specifically deep sea mining related. I've got two more things. On the one hand, I'd like to ask you, I've seen a little bit of chatter in the US about the sweeping executive orders from the incoming administration and what that means for certainty in the U.S. mining sector. I don't know if you've got any insights there about whether that's how disruptive that is for mining. I know that certainty and foreseeability is often spoken of as kind of like one of the absolute crucial factors for having these long-term projects built out.
I think if you're in the minerals industry in the US, I think on one hand, the current or the new administration is, and in fact the bipartisan support for critical minerals and mining in general in the US. I think there's something that's changed over the past maybe decade or so, and I think that there's an acknowledgement that mining and processing and refining should happen in the US, push to support for that, and But the type of support we see, we will see, I'm not sure of. The previous administration, the Department of Energy was giving out loans to support the constructions of mines and so on. And there was quite a bit of money coming into research in economic geology and mining and mining engineering, mineral processing and so on. The current administration or the new administration has talked about enabling faster permitting and things like that, which would certainly please some people in the minerals industry. But we wait to see what happens on the kind of research and the financial support side, whether that level of support would still be given to companies who are interested in mining and processing and things like that in the US. And the other side of this is the tariffs that people have been discussing, because if you think about if we take the lithium-ion battery manufacturing sector in the US, those lithium-ion batteries have lithium in them, and that lithium could be produced in the US from like here in Nevada, where we have a lot of lithium resources, but you also need nickel, cobalt, copper, graphite, and so on. And if you take nickel as an example, we have one nickel mine in the US in Michigan right now. That nickel is smelted in Canada. So if you're a lithium-ion battery manufacturer working in the US, what you're looking at is you're looking at nickel being mined in the US, being sent to Canada, where there's presumably going to be a tariff on it from the Canadians. If tariffs went ahead, then it would have to come back to the US, where there'd be another tariff on it. And so, that causes significant increases in the price of that nickel. And there's an awful lot of mineral and metal processing that happens in China, of copper, load of critical metals and things that we consider, the metals and minerals we consider critical over here. Lots of steel and so on is being produced over there. And it's okay to say, we should actually focus on domestic sources of these, but those domestic sources have a long lead in time. Unless you want to start building smelters left, right, and center across the US, then and developing mines to feed those smelters, then the situation is always going to be a globalized one where metals and minerals, like we were talking about earlier, kind of come from all sorts of different places and have intermediate steps that are in all sorts of different countries. So I think that could be challenging for miners elsewhere supplying the US. It could be challenging for miners in the US if they have to get their materials smelted and refined elsewhere. And I think that those international trades and those international supply chains it's being subject to increased uncertainty as a result of the potential of tariffs and trade wars that we see being discussed right now, and we will wait and see what happens on that front.
Okay, so then I think my last question, you used the word critical minerals a couple of times in that answer, and I feel like the term critical minerals or critical minerals has really entered the public conversation. And yet the definition of it, I expect that very few people in kind of the general public have really turned their minds to. Like, it's, in a way, it kind of makes sense. Critical metals are the metals that are important. But what do you think of critical minerals as a term of art, as a term of science? And are you able to kind of explain to the listener what that term means?
So in a sort of strict sense, a critical mineral or critical metal, the metal and mineral terms are interchangeable depending on where you are in many cases. They are things that are metals or minerals. So it could be nickel, it could be zinc, it could be graphite, which is a mineral rather than a metal. These are minerals or metals that are vital for things like low and zero carbon dioxide energy generation, storage, transport, and so on. So in other words, they're crucial for the energy transition. They could also be strategic. So, some of the rare earth elements are used in laser sights for armaments, munitions, and so on. So they have both economic and national security implications for different countries, but they're subject to insecure supply chains, so that they have an inherently insecure chain of supply. So one example would be, people often talk about the rare earths as being critical. They're critical for a variety of reasons, things like neodymium magnets and as I say, the use of various rare earths in smart technologies, but also in defense technologies. And the security of supply is at risk because here in the US, the vast majority of rare earths we get is still from China. So it's that lack of security of supply that is what makes them critical. It's the fact that we don't need them. It's these are essentially minerals and metals we really need for a variety of reasons that we don't have a secure access to. that varies according to the eye of the beholder. Like here in the US, we don't consider molybdenum a critical metal because we have major molybdenum mines that actually produce molybdenum that can come into the economy. Other countries may well consider molybdenum as critical because they don't have that supply. This all it's down to the security of the supply chain, which is a function of where deposits are, where processing occurs, but also geopolitics and who's friendly with who. So, if we're sourcing things from Australia and Canada, then at the moment we have fairly friendly relations. If we're sourcing things from China, then, we've already seen tariffs being put on exports and imports from China and the US by each other's countries. And that suggests we're not off to a good start in terms of relations between China and the US under this new administration. So I think, and you can see how, like, rare earths is a good example because we have a major rare earth element mine at Mountain Pass in the US, but for a significant period of time, those rare earths have been processed in China. So we've been mining them domestically in the US, but we haven't had the capacity or ability to refine them in the US. So that supply chain is insecure because we need to ship them to China for processing, then we get them back to put in the products that we manufacture here. And those gaps in secure supply chains are what need to be addressed if you want to reduce criticality of critical metals and minerals.
Right. So it's actually quite a subjective term. What's critical for you isn't going to be critical for me necessarily, and what's critical for you is also going to change depending on what's important for your economy, what's important for your defense system, but also what your relationships are with potentially with me and what I do.
And also things like how much, for example, the opening up of new mines, new processing facilities domestically, all of that can change criticalities. And if you, for example, go from a cobalt-rich cathode in your lithium-ion battery to a nickel-rich cathode, then, that would diminish demand for cobalt, which could actually make it less critical, but increase it for nickel and so on. There's no hard and fast rule. It's very much a spectrum of criticality that people put dividing lines because we have to define what is critical and what isn't critical. And we're also seeing other changes. So Australia, for example, considered or maybe even considers nickel as critical. They don't have any problem supplying nickel, but the nickel nickel mining is a major part of the West Australian economy. So, they classified nickel as critical to ensure that mining sector could actually get some financial support that they'd offer to other producers of critical metals. So we're saying criticality is like resources and reserves. It's dynamic, it's changing, and it very much changes on geopolitics, on the supply in a country, on the demand in a country, on where intermediate steps occur, and also just on the eye of the beholder. Different sectors, they consider different things critical.
Yeah, it seems like in the Canadian context, they're almost using critical minerals as a marketing term to say, these are the minerals that are actually not critical for us as Canadians. I could be wrong about this, but this is just my perception is we've kind of made this list of critical minerals. These are minerals that we have to sell to the US, for example, and we should be increasing access and funding and opportunity for developing these minerals in Canada because they're critical elsewhere. But it really doesn't fit into we are worried about having a shortage of these minerals in Canada. And maybe that was similar to what you said about Australia. I don't know if I'm just misunderstanding what Canada is doing with their critical minerals.
I think you're right in that. I think some of the minerals on the Canadian list are things that the Canadian industry wants but doesn't necessarily have. But some of them are certainly minerals and metals that Canada produces and exports. And I think that shifting in criticality, or almost a splitting of consideration of criticality between suppliers and demanders, if you like, is something we're seeing more of. This is probably what confuses people about critical metals and minerals, and especially if you're an Australian looking at what the US considers critical, and you're kind of wondering why those decisions have been made. Then that's kind of it's all. Every single viewpoint has a different kind of concept of criticality, and I think we've moved away from that original concept of this insecure supply chain, but these things being vital, to being very much in the eye of the beholder, and coming down to policy, geopolitics, and what people think would actually benefit different sectors of the minerals industry in a company, or manufacturing industry in a given country, and the like.
Does the US have a single critical minerals list?
The US has an overarching federal critical metals and critical minerals list That's defined by the USGS, and there's going to be a new one coming out this year. But then the Department of Energy also has its own separate critical metal minerals list, which is different. So, like, copper is on the critical minerals list for the Department of Energy, but is not on the federal critical minerals list. So the federal government can offer significant advantages in terms of expedited permitting, tax breaks, and so on to producers of nickel, but not necessarily to copper, because copper isn't as yet classified as a critical mineral on the overarching federal list.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, well, yeah, that's covered most of my questions that I had for you, and I feel like I've used up quite a good amount of your time. Is there anything else you'd like to mention before we wrap up?
Not that I can think of. I think, well, there is one thing I would say is that, the more people think about where things come from, I think the better for all of us. We use metals and minerals, a huge amount of metals and minerals in everyday life, and we need to think about where they come from. And I think one of the key things we need to emphasize to people is that, the minerals industry is a huge part of our lives, and also geology and the geosciences is crucial to modern standards of living and modern life. So if people there's a huge amount of opportunity to get involved in any aspect of the geosciences, but certainly the economic geology and other aspects relating to the minerals industry. And the more people we have who are interested, the better, because workforce challenges in this sector are going to be huge and going forward. We're already struggling to find the people we need, and there's people, because of that disconnect between, say, the minerals industry and people who don't think necessarily about where things like copper comes from. That disconnect means that people aren't thinking about the minerals industry or research associated with it as a viable career. We need to kind of change that thinking around somehow, because otherwise we may run out of people working in the minerals industry before we run out of the minerals themselves.
Wow, that's fascinating. So everyone is projecting a major ramp up in demand, and kind of the public conversation is learning about critical minerals, and yet the field of kind of mineral studies is struggling to attract talent.
Yeah, if you look at, for example, graduation numbers of mining engineers in Australia and the US, they've over the last kind of decade, they've gradually gone down. So we're in a situation where we know we're gonna need more people, but we don't know where those people are going to come from.
Well, I guess, kids, if you're listening, then that sounds like it's going to be at least a well-paid career if the supply is low and the demand is only growing.
And we're going to be in the energy transition for the next 2 to 3 decades. So that means that this is almost going to be unprecedented in terms of some of the demand we're going to see for metals and minerals. And I think that means that it's going to be exciting, or perhaps the term might be interesting times ahead.
Okay. Well, Simon Jowitt, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to me today. Where can people follow you, keep up with what you're interested in?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, or X, as I guess it's called. Those are the two main areas. So, and there's not many people around with my surname. So if you just look up Simon Jowitt on Google, you'll come across me in one way or another.
Okay. Well then, yeah. Thanks again for your time.